Armageddon is over, and you didn't even know it had started. Although, as I finished this video, Russia had just invaded Ukraine about a week ago. Depending on when you see this video, you may be thinking that Armageddon had just started. And here I am telling you that it was over long ago. Note that I'll be addressing the Russia versus Ukraine situation and world peace later in this video, after I tell you about the history of Armageddon. Well, Armageddon is over, but the hailstones bombarding humanity from that seventh bowl of wrath just keep coming and coming and coming. More about that shortly. And that reference to the seventh bowl of wrath is from the book of Revelation, chapter 16, verse 21. What? Your mind is saying, what is she talking about? You are wondering, if it's over, when did it happen? Where was it? How did I miss it? Where are all the dead bodies that are supposed to be the result of it? And the blood up to the horses' bridles? Where's that? And where the heck is the returned Christ? Wasn't he supposed to be here when Armageddon happened? You're wondering how you could have missed these and other foretold events. There are a lot of very expectant voices right now, loudly proclaiming the imminent return of Christ and giving their warnings that the battle of Armageddon is on the horizon, and here I am telling you it's all in the past. Sometimes it seems like some people are looking forward to it, this scenario of a terrible bloody battle. So where is Armageddon? What is Armageddon? The place is actually Megiddo, an ancient city about 20 to 30 miles southeast of Haifa, a port city on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea in present-day Israel. Haifa is on and around Mount Carmel, where the cave of Elijah is located, by the way. Megiddo is in the Carmel mountain range at a pass through the mountains, thus an early trade route developed through this area. That is also why it is a special military advantage for attacking your enemy coming through the pass, as long as you were there first to get possession of the high ground. Megiddo is also known as Har Megiddo, which is Hebrew, meaning hill or mount of Megiddo. The Greek term is Armageddon. The ruins of Megiddo still exist, but it's just an archaeology site now with some small Israeli settlements nearby. The map on the left shows the eastern area of the Mediterranean Sea. The tiny red box is enlarged as shown on the inset map on the right. The enlarged area shows the more modern boundaries of that area with the nation of Israel, formerly part of Palestine, shown. It's the northern part of Israel depicted here, for the most part. A special note here. Disregard all the national boundaries on the maps. Few of these national boundaries existed when Armageddon occurred. The nations of Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq did not yet exist, at least not with the boundaries shown here. Most of them did not exist at all yet. These maps are just to help you understand where Armageddon occurred in reference to current national boundaries. Note the locations of Megiddo, which is in the bottom of the map on the right, more in the central area with the big red arrow pointing to it. The town of Haifa, which is more on the left side, halfway down, central area on the left. And the location of Mount Carmel. A slightly larger map of this enlarged area is on the next slide. Here is that enlarged map showing Palestine at the time that Armageddon happened, years before the State of Israel was created after World War II. The location of Megiddo is shown above the center of the map. Jerusalem is just below the center of the map. Megiddo is about 35 miles from Jerusalem to its south, and about 20 miles from Haifa, which is located on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. Across the harbor from Haifa is the walled prison city of Akka, also known as Acre, an ancient city that has been used as a prison, army barracks, and many other uses at various times in its long history. Akka even played a very important role to Christian soldiers during the Crusades. Remarkably, with all the hype about Armageddon supposedly coming, there's only one actual reference to that specific word in the Bible, and that is in the book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible, chapter 16, verse 16. And here's the text of the book of Revelation, chapter 16, verses 12 to 16. Quote, "Then the sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up, so that the way of the kings from the east might be prepared. And I saw 3 unclean spirits like frogs coming out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. For they are spirits of demons, performing signs which go out to the kings of the earth and of the whole world, to gather them to the battle of the great day of God Almighty. Behold, I am coming as a thief. Blessed is he who watches and keeps his garments, lest he walk naked and they see his shame. And they gathered them together to the place called in Hebrew Armageddon." End quote. Also note in verse 15, Jesus, who is revealing this vision to John, states he will return as a thief in the night. We'll talk more about that later. First, let's go back to before the sixth angel pours his bowl of God's wrath on the Euphrates, to when the fifth angel poured its bowl or pitcher of wrath, and that was onto the throne of the beast. The beast's kingdom became full of darkness, and they gnawed their tongues because of the pain. A beast, according to Bible prophecy symbolism, denotes a king or ruler of a worldly kingdom. Here, this beast, the third beast of the book of Revelation, the one with 2 horns, displeases God by rejecting the latest manifestation of God, who I'll tell you about later. Thus, the throne of that kingdom is in spiritual darkness due to their actions against the new Messiah's new dispensation. The throne of the beast that became full of darkness was the area of the Persian kingdom, and later also the Ottoman Empire. But I'm not going to explain here what the full real meanings of the throne of the beast is. This artwork rendition of the throne of the beast is an artist's depiction of this. However, please don't take it literally. It is symbolic of the spiritual condition of this king and his kingdom, spiritually dark. If you want to know more about the meanings of the book of Revelation, especially who the beasts of Revelation were, at the end of this video, there will be more information about some videos about the book of Revelation. After the beast's throne had been darkened, meaning bereft of the splendor of God since they repudiated the manifestation of God that was sent to them, the returned Christ in the persons of the glory of God and his forerunner, the Elijah figure, then Armageddon is convened after the sixth angel pours his bowl of wrath of God on the Euphrates. This is the area of the world where Armageddon happened, the Middle East. The city of Babylon, now just ruins, was on the Euphrates, and the nearby city of Baghdad is on the Tigris River. This map shows the Euphrates River, which was mentioned in the book of Revelation where Armageddon was mentioned. So, after the sixth angel pours the contents of its bowl or pitcher over the Euphrates, meaning that area of the world, the Middle East, Armageddon is set up to occur. And then Armageddon happened, past tense. But if it happened already, where is the returned Christ, you might ask? Wasn't he supposed to return near the time of Armageddon? Yes, the Christ Spirit has returned already. He, the Messiah, came exactly as Jesus the Christ promised, as a thief or as a thief in the night. There are several verses in the New Testament that refer to Christ's return as his coming like a thief, such as you see listed here. Note that 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 verse 2 states in it that the day of the Lord cometh as a thief in the night. And note that the day of the Lord means the appearance of a prophet or manifestation of God. Then we have 2 Peter chapter 3 verse 10 and Luke chapter 12 verses 39 and 40. Those are according to Jesus in the parable of the good man of the house. And in the book of Matthew chapter 24 verse 43, and it's basically the same parable as described above in Luke. And in the book of Revelation chapter 3 verse 3 and in chapter 16 verse 15, Jesus the Christ himself prophesied in John's vision that when he, the Messiah, the Christ, would return, he would come as a thief. So what is the objective of a thief, especially as a thief in the night, as some verses state? Does he knock on the door first? Does he make a lot of noise so that the homeowner will likely wake up and catch him? After he grabs everything he wants out of the house, does the thief clang some pots and pans together to wake the people up so that they will catch him? Obviously, the answer is no to all those questions. Jesus himself came down from heaven, those were his words, even though he was born to an earthly woman. Very few people believed he was the Messiah, and he definitely didn't come from heaven, so they thought. He was crucified on the cross. His small group of believers left the area in a quest to spread the faith to other peoples, and of course the forced diaspora of the Jews and the early Christians, when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70 A.D., these few believers were spread over a larger area. It wasn't for over 300 years that the Christian faith became somewhat known and beginning to be accepted. So Jesus himself also came as a thief in the night in the first advent, meaning that Jesus came to us, taught his revelation, and left this earth, and it was only after about 3 centuries that his faith became accepted in any major way or area. Why would it be a surprise that it would be the same in the second coming of the Anointed One, especially since Jesus himself foretold it? How did this past event I'm calling Armageddon have anything to do with this return of Christ, return of the Anointed One that the book of Revelation predicts? The answer: where and when Armageddon occurred resulted in the saving of the returned Messiah's new infant faith and a small community of his believers in the Holy Land. It was through this battle that the survival of the infant faith was assured. Our story of the history of Armageddon begins with an introduction to the main characters, who are the Forerunner, who was the herald to the new Messiah, just as John the Baptist was the herald to Jesus Christ. Then, the Messiah of the latter days. We are living in the latter days still, by the way. Then there's the servant. After those introductions, our drama begins. The players in the drama are introduced, the battlefront described, the point at which the life of the servant is endangered is mentioned and explained. The big event ensues, Armageddon, followed by the resolution. The real identities of the main characters, the Forerunner, the Messiah, and the servant, are revealed, and it ends with a bit of a postscript. The Messiah of the Second Coming, a little recent history. The Messiah of the Second Coming had a forerunner, just like Jesus had, to announce his coming and to prepare the way. The forerunner, the Elijah of the returned Messiah, announced his identity and mission in May of 1844. The Forerunner was the Lamb prophesied as coming before the one who sits on the throne, who is the Messiah of the second coming, of the book of Revelation. The Forerunner announced his identity and mission in 1844 in Shiraz, Persia, in the ancient land known as Elam, which was prophesied in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 49, verse 38, quote, "And I will set my throne in Elam," end quote, in the last days. He announced that he was the forerunner of him whom God shall make manifest, another manifestation of God who would shortly appear, who would bring a revelation from God even greater than his own. The Forerunner made a public proclamation of his identity as follows, quote, I am, the promised one. I am the one whose name you have for 1,000 years invoked, at whose mention you have risen, whose advent you have longed to witness, in the hour of whose revelation you have prayed God to hasten. Verily I say, it is incumbent upon the peoples of both the East and the West to obey my word and to pledge allegiance to my person. End quote. The Forerunner's mission lasted 6 years. He was killed in July 1850 at the order of the King of Persia, which was instigated by the Muslim clergy. The Messiah did indeed appear shortly after the martyrdom of the Forerunner, just as the Forerunner foretold. The new Messiah was born in 1817 in Tehran, Persia, now known as Iran. He became a follower of the Forerunner, recognizing the divine truth of his teachings. The Messiah was of Persian noble lineage, a descendant of the Sasanian dynasty of kings. He was also a descendant of Abraham through both Sarah and Abraham's third wife, Keturah. After the Forerunner was killed in 1850, nearly 20,000 of the followers of the Forerunner were also killed by the government forces and by some fanatical Muslims. The Persian authorities did not kill the Messiah because the killing of someone of noble lineage perhaps was not manageable. The Messiah was well known and thought of very highly by many people in high positions. He was instead sent to the Black Pit prison, which was an underground dungeon filled with filth, pestilence, horrid odor, and no light. His months there left him permanently scarred from chains that weighed over 100 pounds. While in that Black Pit prison in late 1852, the Messiah had a vision in which it was revealed to him that he was him whom God shall make manifest, that the Forerunner had prophesied would shortly appear. The Messiah told no one of this vision and his divine identity for about 10 years thereafter. Instead of being killed as a follower of the Forerunner, in 1853 the Messiah, with his family and some other followers of the Forerunner, were exiled as prisoners to the city of Baghdad in the Ottoman Empire. The Messiah remained in the area of Baghdad for about 10 years. He was still a prisoner, although after several years the provincial governor came to respect him and gave him a little leeway. For about a 2-year period out of these 10 years, the Messiah went on a self-imposed solitary exile into the mountains of Suleymania, in the Kurdish area of the present-day Iraq. The Messiah returned to Baghdad after this time alone in the mountains. After 10 years of forced exile in Baghdad, the Messiah had made too many friends in the area for the comfort of the Persian king and the clergy, so they insisted to the Ottoman government that he be removed away from the area. So orders came from the Ottoman Empire to take the Messiah as a prisoner to Constantinople. Just before the forced exile, The Messiah announced in April 1863 to his family, friends, and fellow believers in the Forerunner that he was the prophesied him whom God shall make manifest that the Forerunner had foretold, meaning he was the Messiah of the latter days. His claim that he is the Messiah to the Jews, the return of the Christ in the station of the Father, the one shepherd prophesied in Isaiah, the Lord of hosts, the one who sits on the throne in the book of Revelation, the fifth Buddha, the Buddha Maitreya, the 10th avatar to the Hindus, the Shah Bahram to the Zoroastrians, and others as well. After several more exiles as a prisoner, the Messiah was sent as a prisoner to the walled prison city of Akka in Palestine. In 1868, he arrived in the Mediterranean port city of Haifa at the foot of Mount Carmel. He was then transferred to the prison in Akka, which he later referred to as the most great prison because of the terrible sufferings he, his family, and followers experienced there. Here is a map that shows the forced travels of the Messiah as a prisoner. He was exiled first from Tehran to Baghdad from the land of his birth, Persia, then sent to Constantinople, now known as Istanbul, then to Adrianople, now known as Edirne, then to the prison city of Akka in Palestine as the final locale of his exiles. Remember, none of these travels were of his own volition, first by order of the Persian king, then by order of the Sultan and Caliph of the Ottoman Empire. This photo was taken in the year 2010, looking down from the top of Mount Carmel, down on the city of Haifa. Now, when the Messiah arrived in Haifa, for just a short while before being shipped over to the prison city of Akka, this was not what he saw. He saw a tiny village. This is an old photo of the prison where the Messiah and his family were incarcerated in Akka, Palestine. Just a little sidebar here, an odd bit of history about the German Templars of Haifa, Palestine. These Templars had no relation whatsoever with the other Templars of history and lore. I call their story an odd bit of history because it is very odd, and a bit on the sad side too. In 1863, a group of Germans calling themselves the Templars arrived in Haifa to await the coming of the Messiah, who they expected to appear on Mount Carmel at the end times, which they expected imminently. They had sold all their belongings in Germany to come to the Holy Land, to the spot they believed, from biblical prophecies, to be the location where the Messiah would appear. They built a village at the foot of Mount Carmel in Haifa with distinctive red tile roofs. Many of the buildings with the red roofs that you see along both sides of the street in this photograph taken in 2010 are the original German Templar buildings that they built after their arrival in Haifa in 1863. Here's a little closer view of some of the buildings. Many of the original Templar buildings have been renovated. Some other new buildings have been built to resemble the original Templar buildings, often including the red tile roofs. The lintels above their doorways had engraved messages about the coming Messiah, who they were so adamant and vehement about his return. Note the reference to Komm Herr Jesu. The meaning of the entire phrase is, the Spirit and the bride says, "Come, Lord Jesus." Another lintel-mounted message states, I think, "Aus der Tiefe rufe ich Herr zu dir," which means, "From the depths I call to you, Lord." I don't read or speak German. I think that's obvious. But this is what Google Translate tells me it says. Another one states, "Der Herr ist nahe," which means, "The Lord is near." Yes, he was very near. But it is my theory that they were too set on what he would look like that they closed their minds to the reality all around them, the actual presence of the Messiah and some of his followers. They failed to recognize the Messiah, who was imprisoned across the bay from Haifa in Akka. And they never did recognize what they so wanted to do, is that meet the Messiah. That's why they moved all the way from Germany to here, and yet they just they weren't spiritually receptive to people who looked differently from them, is my theory. That is why I think this story is rather sad. Back to the story of the Messiah. The Messiah taught his new revelation from God for about 40 years. He wrote over 100 tablets and books containing his laws and counsels for our age. He passed away in 1892, and his sanctuary is outside of Akka. He left a written will that designated his son, the servant, as the leader of his faith and his body of believers, at that time mostly in Persia and what is now Iraq and the Holy Land. This photo is of the grounds of the Messiah's sanctuary, which is the final resting place for God's manifestation for this era. That's the smaller building beyond this beautiful gate. It's at the end of the path with that door that you see directly beyond the gate. And again, it's located outside of Akka, Israel. Upon the passing of the Messiah to the heavenly realm, his son, the servant, was designated by the written will of the Messiah as the leader of the new faith and the community of believers. The servant eventually took up residence in Haifa. He administered and directed the affairs of the new faith to achieve the divine goals set forth in the Messiah's last will and testament. Among many other tasks guiding and assuring the survival of the new faith, the servant supervised the building of the resting places for the Forerunner and the Messiah in the Holy Land. Between the years 1910 to 1913, the servant traveled extensively, including Europe, England, Canada, and the United States, to spread the loving message of the Messiah. The very first time the new faith was mentioned in the USA was at the 1893 Parliament of Religions held in Chicago, Illinois, which was a part of the 1893 World Fair held in Chicago. He spoke of the Messiah's message of world peace and the oneness of humankind in churches, synagogues, in other public venues, and even in private homes. Now the photo is of the servant in his later years. Many people became followers of the new faith in these countries, or became sincere friends of the faith. The servant corresponded with the faith community back in Palestine during this time away from Haifa to direct agricultural endeavors to help assure the survival of the community, even directing them to renovate the ancient Roman grain storage pits. In October 1912, while on his travels in Europe and the West, the servant made this prediction, quote, "We are on the eve of the Battle of Armageddon, referred to in the 16th chapter of Revelation. The time is 2 years hence, when only a spark will set aflame the whole of Europe. By 1917, kingdoms will fall and cataclysms will rock the earth." End quote. The servant returned to Haifa in 1913. And just for your information, the World Center, the administrative functions of this new faith, is located on the side of Mount Carmel in Haifa. In case you're wondering, the identities of the Forerunner, the Messiah, the servant, and the new faith will be revealed later in this presentation. At this point, I'll introduce some world events into our story, events that will lead to and involve, as promised, the Battle of Armageddon, actually a couple battles. On June 28, 1914, the assassination of the Austria-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand occurred in Sarajevo. This was the spark that set Europe aflame, just as the servant had predicted back in October 1912. World War I began when Austria declared war on Serbia on July 28, 1914. This triggered the agreements in numerous treaties between many other nations that led to war that rapidly spread to many nations to become World War I. The participants in World War I, the players in World War I, were, for the Allies, on the left with the green background, the United Kingdom, which included Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Hong Kong, and some others, France, Russia, Japan, Italy, the USA, but only after April 6th of 1917, and some others to some minor extents. The Axis powers on the right there were Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and the Kingdom of Bulgaria. There were many war fronts in World War I: the Western Europe Front, the Eastern Europe Front, Gallipoli Front, there the Allies failed, the Italian Front, mostly around Isonzo, the African Front, the Far East Front, the Mesopotamia Front, and the Palestine Front, which is where our drama occurred. The red arrow at the bottom points to the territory of the areas involved directly in the fighting on the Palestine Front during World War I that are of our concern here. In early to mid-1917, the Turkish and German troops controlled the Sinai north to Turkey. The literal Armageddon referred to the area of the Palestine Front. It should be noted that the symbolic meaning of the Battle of Armageddon is a spiritual battle between the new manifestations of God, that's the Forerunner and the Messiah, their followers, and the new revelation from God, the New Jerusalem, triumphing over their spiritual enemies who wanted to destroy it all. This symbolic Armageddon is not quite over. There remain some enemies of the new faith even in this 21st century. The nations battling at the Palestine Front, you can see by the list of participants in the Allies column and the Axis powers column, that it was a very diverse assemblage of nations involved. The Allies included Britain, New Zealand, Australia, France, British West Indies, India, China, that's Hong Kong and Singapore, South Africa, Palestinian volunteers, the Arab Irregular Army led by Emir Faisal and Colonel Lawrence. Remember Lawrence of Arabia? The one and the same. And the Egyptian Camel Corps. The Axis nations were Turkey, that's the Ottoman Empire, and Germany. Initially starting in 1914, the Allies were mostly British troops, some Australian and New Zealand troops, and the rebel Arab forces. But when Russia pulled out of World War I in early 1918 after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, the European United Kingdom troops were sent back to reinforce the Western Front in Europe. The Allied forces in the Palestine Front then were reinforced by nations in the United Kingdom other than from Britain and Ireland, etc. Note that there were even some troops from China, India, and the British West Indies. By the way, when I refer to British troops or United Kingdom troops in the remainder of the presentation, just remember I am including all the other troops of various nations that were part of the Allies. I'm not forgetting them. It's just easier to say British or United Kingdom alone. Also, the military leadership was British. It saves time, and I'm also verbally lazy, I guess. Arab rebels were involved, if you noticed. The Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire began in June 1915. The famous Lawrence of Arabia was actually a British Army officer, T.E. Lawrence. He led some Arab rebels in capturing the port city of Aqaba and other military objectives during World War I. It should be noted that the troops were primarily cavalry troops. This means that horses had to be fed and watered in addition to feeding and watering the soldiers. The British did have some Egyptian camel corps too. There also were some airplanes on both sides. The British Navy assisted in providing artillery fire from their positions on the Mediterranean coast, and rather curiously there were some armored vehicles called LAMs, acronym Light Armored Motorized Battalions. If you recall, the book of Revelation speaks of the Lamb coming, who we now know was actually the forerunner of the Messiah. But this LAMB acronym was not lost on the British troops. There was much discussion of the circumstances of a war in this area of the world. Many people were convinced that they were fighting in Armageddon at the time it was happening. We have to start with a little background about the Palestine Front from the years 1914 to 1916. During those years, the British troops were headquartered in Egypt. On October 19, 1914, the first armed encounter between the sides in the Palestine Front was a naval encounter. The Allies did not make much progress against the Turkish and German armies for several years. The year 1917 didn't start out very well for the British troops. On March 27, 1917, the first battle of Gaza, the British attacked but lost the battle. On April 19th, the second battle of Gaza, again the British failed. In July 1917, General Edmund Allenby assumed command of the British and Allied forces in Egypt. Things seemed to turn around for the better for the British Army after that. Also in July, on the 6th, Arab rebels led by Lawrence of Arabia seized the port city of Aqaba. On October 27th of 1917, the British defeated the Turkish army at Beersheba and took possession of 17 water wells essential for their military needs. Then, on October 31st through November 7th, the third Battle of Gaza occurred. This time the British troops broke through the Turkish lines and were successful in pushing them north. Gaza was finally taken by the British. Note the location of Beersheba and Gaza near the bottom of the map. Remember how crucial a good water supply for the horses and soldiers was in this desert terrain. With the winning of Beersheba, with all their water wells, the cavalry was able to head north to Jerusalem. November 16, 1917, the town of Jaffa was taken by the British troops. December 8th, the order came to the British to invade and capture Jerusalem. December 8th through the 10th, the Battle of Jerusalem. It fell to the British troops. The British entered the city of Jerusalem on December 10th. A British Army officer, Wellesley Tudor Pole, in the Palestine Front arena, also happened to be very familiar with the servant, whom he had met when the servant visited England, and he knew the teachings of the new faith. Tudor Pole was wounded in battle in December of 1917 and was sent back to Egypt to recuperate. He was assigned to work in the military intelligence unit. Through these connections, he was informed from several sources of a threat on the life of the servant. Now I'll introduce to you a man called Ahmed Jamal Pasha. The term Pasha is a military title, by the way, not the last name of him. Jamal Pasha was commander of several of the Turkish armies. He was one of the three most powerful people in Turkey as the result of the Young Turk Rebellion in 1908. He considered the servant an enemy, even though the servant never said or did anything against Jamal Pasha or Turkey or its government. Jamal Pasha threatened to crucify the servant and his family if the British army advanced north towards Haifa. This threat became known far and wide. The servant was well known throughout the region, and word spread very quickly out of a concern for his well-being. It's important to note here that if the servant perished, the new faith, the message from the Messiah for this age, could likely perish with him. The servant was the head of the new faith at that time, since the passing of the Messiah, his father, in 1892. Now Wellesley Tudor Pole takes up his role in this drama. Wellesley Tudor Pole became alarmed at the prospect of this man of peace and love, the servant, being killed. He brought his concerns to the attention of his superior officers, who did nothing in response. Because his superiors did nothing to help save the servant, Tudor Pole wrote a couple letters to influential people he knew in Britain who knew the servant, asking for their help. He also asked a fellow British officer to personally deliver a message, since this man was shortly to return to England. Alas, due to it being wartime, Tudor Pole's messages did not get delivered to their addressees for almost 50 days. Then it took some time for the servant's devoted followers in England to make and implement their plans for getting their concerns heard in the right quarters. It finally resulted in several influential people in England lobbying the War Department, some members of Parliament, among others, about their concerns for the life of the servant. This lobbying effort was successful in that members of the British government sent a telegraph to the British Army Command headquarters in Egypt about the concerns about the threat on the life of the servant. Tudor Pole himself was given the task of explaining the death threat against the servant directly to General Edmund Allenby. The early part of 1918 was mostly a time for the British Army to recuperate and prepare for a push north to defeat the Turkish and German armies. Britain sent some additional Army command personnel to help in the planning. But in August 1918, General Allenby had formulated a new plan to push north and corner the Turkish army near Megiddo. General Allenby's new plan was to gather forces for a full-throttle campaign to eliminate all three Turkish armies and their German helpers at once. The likely location of a major battle was to be near Megiddo, meaning Armageddon. By the way, General Allenby was a religious man, well versed in the Bible. He was well aware of the significance of the possible fulfillment of chapter 16 of the book of Revelation. There is no evidence, however, that he intentionally did this in order to fulfill biblical prophecies. Apparently, he planned this from a purely military standpoint. Allenby's plan was to use the fast, mobile cavalry to go up the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, over the plain of Sharon, as shown by the heavy red arrow. The intent was to cut off the retreat of the Turkish forces at the Musmus Pass and at Jenin. It all pivoted on the maintenance of secrecy for the British troops to get in position so they could trap the retreating Turkish forces at the Musmus Pass, which is very close to Megiddo. See the arrows pointing to Megiddo and the Musmus Pass. The British engaged in a lot of trickery to fool the Turks and Germans into thinking that the majority of British forces were planning to advance north to the east of the Jordan River, where the thick vertical green arrow indicates. This included having Lawrence of Arabia and his Arab rebels spend a lot of money to the east of the Jordan Valley to buy all the barley around the area, supposedly for his Arab and British forces and their horses. They knew that all the spies would get the word of this back to the Turkish army commanders, in the hope that they would be fooled into thinking that an attack was coming from that area near the Jordan River. A few days before the planned charge to the north along the coast, Lawrence of Arabia and the Arab rebels attacked the Hejaz Railway, which is to the east of the Jordan River. This attack, made in hopes that the Turkish troops would be diverted from the Haifa area to reinforce the troops trying to protect the Hejaz Railway. Luckily, this did occur, and Turkish troops from Haifa headed out to the east to the railway. September 19, 1918, the real attack started. The charge began with an artillery, aircraft, and naval bombardment that only lasted a short duration. Most of their targets were communications lines, telephone, and telegraph. Then about 9,000 cavalry were ordered at 5:30 a.m. to mount and gallop. They were galloping north toward Musmus Pass, which was about 35 miles away. There was also an additional special mission that was also a part of the plan. A couple British regiments had other orders. They left their heavy guns and supplies behind and went north along the coast at high speed. 2 Arab scouts were paid to get these regiments over Mount Carmel, over very rough terrain, made up mostly of goat trails. The majority of the British troops got to their destination, Musmus Pass, well before the retreating Turkish army arrived there. The Turkish troops arrived in the morning. An intense, very bloody battle ensued. The British were victorious. Many Turkish troops were killed, the remainder surrendered. Now back to the regiments climbing over the Carmel mountain range. They were over the mountains and charging north to Nazareth to the German army headquarters. Their mission? Capture the German commander Lyman von Sanders. They captured the town, but von Sanders got away. The Musmus Pass and Jenin were held by the British troops. The 7th Turkish Army was cut off from going north through there, forcing them to the east through the mountains toward the Jordan Valley. They were forced through some very narrow tracks into a column many miles long. Wadi is an Arabic word for a narrow, often deep gully, usually formed by the flow of water during the wet season. A wadi is often a dry riverbed during much of the year and can be dangerous after a torrential, rare rain. This is the type of narrow tracks that the 7th Turkish Army was forced into in order to escape from the British. Wadi Farah was the name of this wadi. The 7th Turkish Army was decimated by aerial attack in the confines of those steep narrows. Every available British plane took part in the slaughter, bombing first the front of the column and blocking the road, then returning to systematically destroy trapped machines, animals, and men. 2 bombers flew over the narrows every 2 to 3 minutes, dropping 20-pound and 112-pound bombs. From 4 a.m. until nearly midday, there was a continuous succession of explosions along with fire from the plane's machine guns. Most of the troops escaped in terror from the bombs, but the terrified animals could not escape the bombs and the gore. The Turkish troops that survived surrendered to the British. Wadi Farah road was blocked to further movement by other Turkish troops. Within 72 hours of the initial attack, 2 of the 3 Turkish armies had been completely wiped out or surrendered. Only the 4th Turkish Army remained. It still occupied the east bank of the Jordan. It was also thought they had garrisons in Akka and Haifa. Allenby's armies headed towards Haifa. These circumstances of the British forces heading toward Haifa put the servant's life at heightened risk. Jamal Pasha had stated that this was the exact scenario that would result in his giving the order to have the servant killed. The remaining Turkish troops in the Haifa and Akka area would know of the defeat of the other armies by now. Meanwhile, back in Haifa, the general populace knew nothing of what was going on. The Turkish and German troops were still in the area. They could see the Germans building huge artillery positions on the side of Mount Carmel in Haifa, aimed at the sea in the event of an invasion from the sea. On September 21, 1918, residents of Haifa noticed the activities of the Turkish troops had changed. The troops started marching towards Nazareth. Later it was realized that they were to reinforce the Turkish and German troops at Nazareth, under attack at the time. Meanwhile, the British forces were becoming increasingly in need of supplies. September 22nd, Turkish and German troops tried to recapture Nazareth. The British successfully defended it. It became known that these troops were from Haifa and that few troops were left there. Allenby sent a light armored motorized battery vehicle to take control of Haifa, but the remaining Turkish troops defended their positions, a failed attempt. The populace of Haifa heard the gunfire and were fearful of the imminent death of the servant by Turkish troops. Meanwhile, the servant gathered his family and the faith community at his home in Haifa. He led them in prayer and spent his time comforting them, assuring them that they would be safe, that the British would not bomb them, and even Akka would be taken by the British with little bloodshed. September 23rd, the British Army attempts to capture Haifa and Akka. Akka surrendered with hardly a shot being fired, just as the servant had foreseen. Haifa was more difficult. Those German guns on Mount Carmel were an obstacle, and the British had to try to get into Haifa through a narrow piece of land, very vulnerable to the guns. The British gunnery did fire, but never into the city itself, by direct order of General Allenby. The British cavalry was divided into 3 sections for this attack: one to climb the mountain to reach and destroy the German guns, another to go through the marshes, and the third to go through the narrow pass into Haifa. The section going through the marshes literally got bogged down. The other 2 sections decided to risk all and charge the gun positions. Both were successful and won. The guns were neutralized. The British Army advanced into Haifa. This photo is of the Indian cavalry of the Jodhpur and Mysore Lancers. The photo legend in the upper right corner states it included the 16th Imperial Service Cavalry Brigade. However, there were other sources that stated it was the 15th, not the 16th Cavalry Brigade. Perhaps it was both. These Indian troops were passing through Haifa following the city's capture from Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, on the 23rd of September 1918. Up to 20% of the United Kingdom troops were from India and included soldiers of Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh backgrounds. A group of British soldiers were dispatched to find the servant. He was found and his safety assured. A guard was set up at his home to keep him protected. Very shortly thereafter, a communication was sent to London to let them know that the servant was safe, to the tremendous relief of the friends and followers of the new faith. Armageddon, the literal battle, was over. The new faith of the returned Messiah was saved from extinction. General Allenby eventually met the servant in the home of the servant in Haifa. The populace of Haifa was so grateful to General Allenby for their rescue that a major road was named after him. Allenby Road. It still exists. The servant became aware of the great need for food for the British troops. He offered some grain from the supplies that the community had been storing up for many years. Remember when the servant had those old Roman storage pits renovated? After the British became aware of the forward-thinking planning of the servant in agricultural endeavors and the storage of the grain that saved many lives of the local populace as well as the British soldiers, the servant was awarded a knighthood, and honor he never mentioned, nor did he ever claim any special treatment for it. Armageddon, per the Bible prophecies, is over. Now we need to talk about what has happened after Armageddon. The verses we saw at the beginning, chapter 16, verses 12 to 16 of the book of Revelation, stated that the Messiah had returned, then Armageddon would occur. So let's go back to the Bible verses from the book of Revelation that followed in chapter 16. That's verses 17 through 21. As I read it, I will be interjecting some explanatory comments into this version. Quote, "After the sixth angel, the seventh angel poured out his bowl into the air." That means the air fills every place, thus the wrath of God fills every place. "And a loud voice came out of the temple of heaven, from the throne, saying, 'It is done.'" The Forerunner and the Messiah had returned. "And there were noises and thunderings and lightnings," problems created within the new faith community from the false prophet and the Antichrist of this new dispensation. "And there was a great earthquake, such a mighty and great earthquake as had not occurred since men were on earth." One meaning of the earthquake was one that occurred in 1853 that killed the regiment of soldiers that had killed the Forerunner by firing squad in 1850. The other meaning was the coming of a great shaking of the earth of religious affairs that occurred because of the coming of the Messiah. Now the great city was divided into three parts, and the cities of the nations fell. And great Babylon, corrupted religions, was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. Then every island fled away, and the mountains, that's the previous existing faiths of God that had been corrupted, were not found. And great hail from heaven fell upon men, each hailstone about the weight of a talent. Men blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail, since the plague was exceedingly great." End quote. An FYI here, a talent is thought to have weighed between 75 to 100 pounds. These hailstones are not literal, but rather symbolic of the tests and difficulties that humankind would undergo because of their failure to recognize and follow the counsels of the new manifestation from God, the Messiah. From the writings of the Messiah, we can discern the types of tribulations we humans would experience. Quote, "The time when men shall become oppressed and afflicted, the time when the lingering traces of the Son of Truth and the fruit of the tree of knowledge and wisdom will have vanished from the midst of men, when the reins of mankind will have fallen into the grasp of the foolish and ignorant, when the portals of divine unity and understanding, the essential and highest purpose in creation, will have been closed. When certain knowledge will have given way to idle fancy, and corruption will have usurped the station of righteousness. Such a condition as this is witnessed in this day when the reins of every community have fallen into the grasp of foolish leaders who lead after their own whims and desires." End quote. And some additional excerpts from the new Messiah's description of this time in history. Quote, "On their tongue the mention of God hath become an empty name. In their midst his holy word a dead letter. Such is the sway of their desires that the lamp of conscience and reason hath been quenched in their hearts. Clinging unto idle fancy, they have strayed far from the sure handle of divine knowledge. Their hearts seem not to be inclined to knowledge and the door thereof, neither think they of its manifestations, inasmuch as in idle fancy that they have found the door that leadeth unto earthly riches, whereas in the manifestation of the revealer of knowledge, the Messiah, they find naught but the call to self-sacrifice." They therefore naturally hold fast unto the former, that is, the idle fancies that lead to riches, and flee from the latter, meaning they flee from the manifestation of God for this new era, the Messiah, and self-sacrifice. End of quotes. What are the end results of humanity pursuing idle fancies and their leadership being corrupted? Poor decisions in every aspect of life, from the little person to the emperor or king. Greed that leads to economic disruption and disasters, and in the process, economic injustices. We are very familiar with that of late. Ignorance prevailing, since idle fancies are paramount to the people, and of course, wars and huge expenditures on weapons from all the above. The hailstones fall, such hailstones as World War I, World War II, numerous other wars, civil wars, police actions, invasions by Russia, countless famines and diseases that took and take many lives, racial prejudices and the terrorism, such as slavery, that resulted, the Great Depression, a worldwide one, recessions, economic ideologies that result in economic injustices from both the extreme right and the extreme left, resulting in human suffering. Political ideologies, too, that often result in terrorism and war. Religious extremism in many religions, resulting in persecutions, killing, including pogroms, such as the Jewish Holocaust, and terrorism in the name of religion. Massive corruption in the governments of many nations that siphon off money to the leaders that should go to their people, resulting in economic hardship and suffering. There are many additional hailstones that have bombarded humanity since World War I. There's not room here to describe them all. The whole of the 20th century was one perpetual hailstorm. The 21st century sees the continuation, but it's our choice when the hail starts to abate, you know. And so the world suffers because of our perversity and the corruption of religious, political, and other societal leaders, because we all fail to follow the counsels of the latest manifestation of God. It will only get worse until we do. That is, until the world follows the counsels of the new Messiah. The new Messiah warns us all, quote, "Know ye that a servant's glory resideth in his nearness unto God, and that, unless he draweth nigh unto him, naught else can ever profit him, even should he hold sway over the entire creation. Say, the breeze of God hath wafted over you from the retreats of paradise, but ye have neglected it and chosen to persist in your waywardness. Guidance hath been given unto you from God, but ye have failed to follow it and preferred to reject its truth. The lamp of God hath been lit within the niche of his cause, but ye have neglected to seek the radiance of its glory and to draw nigh unto its light, and still ye slumber upon the couch of heedlessness." End quote. That's from the new Messiah, from his book, The Summons of the Lord of Hosts. Here are some questions that have probably occurred to you as you listen to this story. Why didn't anyone ever let the world know that Armageddon had happened? Why haven't I heard of the new Messiah and his new faith before? The problem is us. We refuse to recognize the new manifestation of God while he walks the earth, or soon thereafter. The failure of Christians to remember, or ignoring entirely, the instructions of Jesus that he would return as a thief in the night. Case in point, the Great Awakening of the mid-1800s, with Bible scholars predicting his return in or around the year 1844. In the early and mid-1800s, many Christians became convinced that they had discovered the meaning of prophecies of the date of Christ's return, almost all predicted on or around the year 1844. And this was from the Adventist movement, which grew out of actually the Second Great Awakening. When he did not come down out of the sky on a literal cloud on the dates predicted by them, they did not search for him. They might have found the Forerunner had they searched for him. The Forerunner had proclaimed his station in May of 1844. Note that at the end of this presentation there will be information how to access other YouTube videos of mine that explain the Messiah of the Second Coming and the fulfillment of Bible time prophecies of the return. It's called Christ Has Returned, oddly enough. Let's go back to that story we reviewed earlier about the German Templars and their move to Haifa seeking the thief. Why did the German Templars sell all their belongings and move to Haifa from Germany and build a new village in Haifa, Palestine to await der Herr, the Lord, yet miss the Messiah entirely when he was indeed exactly where and when the Bible verses prophesied? Here is one of the Bible verses that told them where he would be. Quote, "The excellency of Carmel and Sharon, they shall see the glory of the Lord, the excellency of our God." End quote. That's from Isaiah chapter 35, verse 2. More reasons why you've never heard of this before? A big reason is traditional expectations of Christ's return. Traditional understanding of prophecies, often literal interpretations of those prophecies, and an unwillingness of people to consider alternative interpretations. We like our traditions, our associations and beliefs. We don't want to change. And sociocentrism. For example, maybe the German Templars thought the Messiah would come down out of the sky, have fair skin, maybe even blue eyes, and probably even speak to them in German. That appears to be the expectation of many literal interpretations of Bible prophecy. The group's version of the fulfillment of prophecies is a Messiah who looks and speaks just like their group. Then there is fear. The fears experienced by the people who recognize the new manifestation of God when others do not. Fear of the loss of social acceptance if the Messiah is not recognized by others, such as your friends, family, and community at large. Fear of the possible loss of power, money, position, perhaps even fear of physical violence through rejection by society or persecution in some circumstances. Fear of change to traditions, beliefs, divine laws, such as laws of marriage and divorce, etc. We are comfortable with things the way we know them, and we just know that the new Messiah will be just like the old one. The way we envision how the Messiah will look, talk, and behave, just like us, of course. Continuing on with the fears that some doubters have. They have the fear of the loss of Jesus or Moses or Zoroaster, etc., whoever the prophet of their faith is. Others have a fear of learning something new, just simply a fear of change. The fear of some Christians is because of a strong personal attachment to the person of Jesus. They fear that somehow by investigating the claims of someone else who has a different name, that they would somehow be rejecting Jesus. The Bible says that the returned Messiah will be a different person and have a new name. See these verses in particular. John chapter 16 verses 13 to 15, the book of Revelation chapter 2 verse 17, Revelation chapter 3 verse 12, for evidence that the returned Christ Spirit will have a different name and will be a different person than Jesus. Note that in the book of Revelation chapter 2 verse 17 and chapter 3 verse 12, Jesus is quite pointedly stating that when he returns in the station of the Father, that entity would have a new name. A personal note. When I recognized the new Messiah, I brought Jesus with me into the new faith, knowing that this is what Jesus had prophesied. I was following the instructions of Jesus. In the book of John, chapter 16, verses 13 to 15 that was mentioned before, Jesus said that the Spirit of truth was coming and referred to him as He throughout, not I. So let's look at those verses just to emphasize this point. Quote, "Howbeit when He, the Spirit of truth, is come, He will guide you into all truth, for He shall not speak of Himself, but whatsoever He shall hear, that shall He speak, and He shall shew you things to come. He shall glorify me, for He shall receive of mine, and shall shew it unto you. All things that the Father hath are mine. Therefore said I, that He shall take of mine, and shall shew it unto you." In those verses, there were mentions of He and Himself, the coming Messiah, 10 times, whereas there were 4 mentions of Jesus speaking of Himself, using the words I, me, or mine. There was a very precise and repeated differentiation that Jesus was making between Himself and the one who would come in the future, the returned Messiah, that this person, the Spirit of truth, would be in a new human temple with a new name. Another major cause of people not accepting the new manifestation of God, the clergy or priesthood of the existing religions. Remember the priests of Egypt when Moses wanted Pharaoh to let his people go? Remember the chief priests and Pharisees who rejected Jesus as the Messiah of the first advent, yet the lowly fishermen had the spiritual insight to recognize the Messiah. There have been legions of wonderful, loving clergy and other leaders of religions. They've cared for the poor and downtrodden, built hospitals and cared for the sick. And they've taught the Word of God and advised wayward souls of the errors of their ways that would endanger their spiritual lives. All exemplary things. But they have the capacity and the offices to lead their flocks in error too, if they fail to recognize the new Messiah. Think again of the Pharisees of Judaism, the learned leadership of the faith who misguided their people to reject Jesus as the Messiah. They may truly have concerns out of the teaching about false prophets. Jesus Christ warned about them, so of course it is of concern. But do they investigate or search for the thief first before they advise their flock that this new faith is a cult? Do they read his writings or investigate his life or faith to examine his fruits before warning their flocks that he is a false prophet? Some may have prejudices that interfere with their spiritual insight. The new Messiah comes from an Islamic background. Can you get past that? Remember, he also descends from Abraham. Some may feel their position and their livelihoods are in jeopardy if they acknowledge the new revelation from God. So one needs to be brave. It takes courage to go outside of tradition and the constraints of traditional societal beliefs and organization. Maybe that is why Jesus warns his followers in the book of Revelation, chapter 21, verse 8. This is from the King James Version of the Bible. But the fearful and unbelieving and the abominable and murderers and whoremongers and sorcerers and idolaters and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. End quote. Think of the courage of the early believers in Moses or Jesus or Muhammad or Buddha. They were outside the norm, and thus many suffered terrible persecution. Most of the others, many following the advice of their clergy, just took the easy way. They followed traditional beliefs rather than think for themselves or change or challenge things as they were. I also underlined the part where Jesus states that all liars shall have their part in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone. Seems awfully pertinent these days when lying seems to have become a sport, especially in politics and the media. The new Messiah himself describes the veils or clouds that obscure the spiritual vision of people. Quote, "The accumulations of vain fancy have obstructed men's ears and stopped them from hearing the voice of God. And the veils of human learning and false imaginings have prevented their eyes from beholding the splendor of the light of his countenance. With the arm of might and power we have rescued a number of souls from the slough of impending extinction and enabled them to attain the dayspring of glory. Moreover, we have laid bare the divine mysteries and in most explicit language foretold future events. That neither the doubts of the faithless, nor the denials of the froward, nor the whisperings of the heedless may keep back the seekers of truth from the source of the light of the one true God. Nevertheless, some people seem to have been seized with epilepsy. Others are torn up even as hollow tree stumps. They abandon God, the most exalted, he before whose revelation of a single verse all the scriptures of the past and of more recent times pale into lowliness and insignificance, and set their hearts on lying tales and follow empty words." End quote. And here's an important question. How do we discern the true prophet from the false? The disciples asked Jesus how they would know a false prophet from a true one when he returned. Jesus said, "Ye shall know them by their fruits." That's from Matthew chapter 7, verse 16. So in order to follow the instructions of Jesus, one must examine the fruits of the Forerunner, the Messiah, the servant, and the new faith. To continue that quote in Matthew chapter 7, verses 16 through 18, quote, "Ye shall know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles? Even so, every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit." End quote. The fruits of the Forerunner include that he was an honest and respected merchant. He demonstrated tremendous courage in the face of a tyrannical king, the king's government officials, and the treacherous Persian Muslim clergy who considered him an apostate. He was unflagging in his teaching of the coming of one greater than he, even while he was under threat of his life. Let's look at the fruits of the Messiah. He forfeited wealth, prestige amongst the ruling class of Persia, and material comfort because of his belief in the life and mission of the Forerunner. A well-respected man who cared about those of little or no position in society. He suffered for over 40 years for all humanity's sake. He bore the chains of imprisonment so that we might be free. The following is a quote from the writings of the Messiah, which are instructions to us, his followers, on how we must conduct our lives. Quote, "Be generous in prosperity, and thankful in adversity. Be worthy of the trust of thy neighbor, and look upon him with a bright and friendly face. Be a treasure to the poor, an admonisher to the rich, an answerer of the cry of the needy, a preserver of the sanctity of thy pledge. Be fair in thy judgment, and guarded in thy speech. Be unjust to no man, and show all meekness to all men. Be as a lamp unto them that walk in darkness, a joy to the sorrowful, a sea for the thirsty, a haven for the distressed, an upholder and defender of the victim of oppression. Let integrity and uprightness distinguish all thine acts. Be a home for the stranger, a balm to the suffering, a tower of strength for the fugitive. Be eyes to the blind, and a guiding light unto the feet of the erring. Be an ornament to the countenance of truth, a crown to the brow of fidelity, a pillar to the temple of righteousness, a breath of life to the body of mankind, an ensign of the hosts of justice, a luminary above the horizon of virtue, a dew to the soil of the human heart, an ark on the ocean of knowledge, a sun in the heaven of bounty, a gem on the diadem of wisdom, a shining light in the firmament of thy generation, a fruit upon the tree of humility." End quote. Are any of these counsels to his followers bad fruit? Again, Jesus said that you cannot get good fruit from a bad tree. More resources will be provided at the end of this presentation for you to research the other good fruits of his teachings, counsels, actions, and his life's works, for you to judge for yourself. Now let's examine some of the good fruits of the servant. The servant spent his life in devotion to his Father, the manifestation of God for this era, the Messiah, to his family, to the believers, and to people of all faiths and of no faith all over the world. He saved many lives during World War I from his foresight regarding agricultural projects that fed the people, with no material gain to himself. He was renowned in the Haifa area for his loving and giving nature to those who were poor, powerless, and the sick. In case you were wondering what a manifestation of God is, well, in this case, he's also known as the Messiah. Other titles of the Divine Spirit are the Spirit, the Alpha and the Omega, the Word, also known as Logos, and other titles too. All of these names or titles refer to this Divine Spirit that God sends to humanity from time to time to guide us. Manifestations of God are the daysprings of God's command, the treasuries of his revelation, and the repositories of his knowledge. They are not incarnations of God, but are rather manifestations of the attributes of God. And for your information, the Greek word epiphany means to make manifest. Here is the description of what a manifestation of God is, from the pen of the new Messiah. Quote, "Wert thou to consider in this station the last of them to be the first, or conversely, thou wouldst indeed be speaking the truth, as hath been ordained by him who is the wellspring of divinity and the source of lordship. For they are all the manifestations of the name of God, the dawning places of his attributes, the repositories of his might, and the focal points of his sovereignty, whilst God, magnified be his might and glory, is in his essence sanctified above all names and exalted beyond even the loftiest attributes. Consider likewise the evidences of divine omnipotence both in their souls and in their human temples, that thine heart may be assured, and that thou mayest be of them that speed through the realms of his nearness." End quote. And here's a list of God's manifestations: Abraham, Krishna, Moses, Zoroaster, Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, the Bab, who was the Forerunner, Baha'u'llah, the new Messiah, and more to come in the future. So now you know who the Forerunner and the Messiah were, the Bab and Baha'u'llah. Again, so it sinks in a little bit more, the Forerunner was a person named the Bab. That was his divine title. The Messiah was a person whose divine title was Baha'u'llah. A little more information follows. Again, the Forerunner was the Bab, which means the gate in English. He was born in Persia in 1819 and was killed by firing squad by the Persian army by order of the king or Shah of Persia. That was in 1850. This is the Shrine of the Bab, a golden domed structure on the side of Mount Carmel in Haifa, and it's the final resting place of the Bab. The Messiah, the manifestation of God for this new era, was Baha'u'llah, which in English means the glory of God. The word Baha means glory. He was born in 1817 and passed on to the heavenly realm in 1892. He is buried outside of Akka, Israel. This is an excerpt from his writings about his station. Quote, "The great being saith, the tongue of wisdom proclaimeth, he that hath me not is bereft of all things. Turn ye away from all that is on earth, and seek none else but me. I am the sun of wisdom and the ocean of knowledge. I cheer the faint and revive the dead. I am the guiding light that illumineth the way. I am the royal falcon on the arm of the Almighty. I unfold the drooping wings of every broken bird, and start it on its flight." End quote. This is the shrine of Baha'u'llah, the final resting place of the Messiah for the new era, the return to Christ's Spirit. The shrine is located just outside of Akka, Israel. And of course, we have the servant. It was the servant and the new faith of the Messiah which were saved by the Battle of Armageddon. The servant was Abdul-Baha, which means in English the servant of Baha, or the servant of the glory. The word Baha means glory. He was the son of Baha'u'llah and was named as the leader of the new faith upon the death of Baha'u'llah by Baha'u'llah's will and testament. He was born in 1844 and passed away in 1921. The servant, Abdul-Baha, was not a manifestation of God. He was fully human. His own explanation of himself, quote, "My name is Abdul-Baha, my reality is Abdul-Baha, and service to all the human race is my perpetual religion," end quote. And that photo is him walking down a street in Haifa near his home. A few more history tidbits. General Allenby, after the taking of Haifa, was assured by his command personnel that Abdul-Baha was safe. He sent a telegraph back to England requesting the authorities to notify the world that Abdul-Baha is safe. General Allenby and his wife had lunch with Abdul-Baha near the site of the sanctuary of Baha'u'llah outside of Akka after the war. When Abdul-Baha passed away in 1921, the then Viscount Allenby, the High Commissioner for Egypt, wired the High Commissioner for Palestine asking him to convey to the relatives of the late Sir Abdul-Baha Abbas Effendi and to the Baha'i community his sincere sympathy in the loss of their revered leader. And this is a photo of Abdul-Baha seated, receiving knighthood for relief of distress and famine during World War I. It took place on the 27th of April, 1920. This is an artist's rendition of the future shrine of Abdul-Baha that is currently under construction near Haifa, Israel. It should be completed soon, and this video is being made in March of 2022. And this is a nighttime view, or presumed nighttime view, of the future shrine of Abdul-Baha. And what is the name of the new faith of the Bab and Baha'u'llah? You may have heard it just a few slides ago. Well, the name is the Baha'i faith. The word Baha means glory. Baha'i means follower of the glory, meaning follower of Baha'u'llah, the glory of God. Here are some of the basic teachings of Baha'u'llah and the Baha'i faith. There's only one God, and there is only one religion of God, which has been revealed progressively from God's manifestations, who have included Moses, Krishna, Zoroaster, Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, and now the Bab and Baha'u'llah, and others to come in the future. The oneness of humankind. We are all members of one race, the human race. The equality of women and men. The independent investigation of truth. We are responsible for our own spiritual advancement and must not blindly follow traditions, movements, and the opinions of others. In line with this teaching, the Baha'i Faith does not have a clergy. The elimination of prejudice. Prejudice results in much suffering, wars, destruction, enmity, and is most often based on misinformation or even disinformation. The unity of science and religion. Baha'u'llah teaches that they must agree. Science without religion can become malignant materialism, and religion without science becomes mere superstition. Economic justice. Abolishing the extremes of poverty and wealth are necessary. Baha'u'llah counsels us that cooperation must replace competition as the basis of organized economic activity. Baha'u'llah accepts the need for private ownership of property and the need for private economic initiative. He calls for the establishment of a minimum income level that meets basic human needs. His teachings also call for progressive taxation to fund the building and maintenance of an ever-advancing civilization. Baha'is who own businesses and have employees are strongly encouraged to share a fourth or fifth part of the net profits with the employees, meaning profit sharing. Number 8, an auxiliary international language must be selected by the nations of the earth to foster understanding between nations and peoples. And this is an auxiliary language, so each nation would keep their own language, but just add a universal language to that. And Baha'u'llah counseled humanity on how to achieve world peace. Humanity must establish a world commonwealth with a parliament whose members must be elected by the people in their respective countries, and whose election shall be confirmed by their respective governments. And a supreme tribunal created whose judgment will have a binding effect, even in such cases where the parties concerned did not voluntarily agree to submit their case for consideration. And in the words of Baha'u'llah, quote, "O concourse of the sovereigns of the world, for thereby will the tempest of discord be stilled amongst you, and your peoples find rest. Should any one among you take up arms against another, rise ye all against him, for this is not but manifest justice." End quote. Those are a few basic spiritual and social teachings, among many. There are many others in our sacred and authoritative texts, virtually an ocean of the Word of God to dive into. There are also laws to be followed. The Baha'i Faith is not a cult or a club or a mere philosophy. The laws are from God, and each person who independently chooses to be a Baha'i should strive to obey those laws. You can check out this website for access to the sacred writings of the Baha'i Faith, www.bahai.org/library. And it is free access. World peace is coming, but we have to work to achieve it. The book of Revelation, which was a vision of the future given by Christ to John of Patmos, Christ promised us that the new Messiah would make all things new. And it will happen, but not by magic. We humans must change ourselves and unify as humans on the same planet, and in the process we will change the world. First will come the lesser peace, as Baha'u'llah, the new Messiah, called it. The lesser peace will be achieved through political, not religious means. And by political, it means by negotiations amongst the nations of the planet. A world parliament must be convened, as stated in a previous slide. the citizens of each nation would elect their own representative to this parliament. To my way of thinking, and this is not an official view of the Baha'i Faith, just my own individual view, that the election of representatives from each nation could augment the current United Nations structure at first, so we'd have two houses of the United Nations Assembly. The House of the Peoples, those are those elected by the people in each nation, and also the current House of Nations, meaning the government-designated representatives, not the elected ones. But this is just conjecture on my part at this moment. That is, conjecture on how the United Nations transitions to what Baha'u'llah stated was necessary to establish world peace. Most importantly, agreements must be among all the nations of the earth that when a rogue nation, group, or leader attacks another nation, that all the other nations will join together and defeat the rogue nation or nations. I'm putting this in the framing of some current events, specifically Russia's invasion of Ukraine in late February 2022. Now, the rationale for this invasion was a mixed bag of dubious excuses. At this writing, March 7, 2022, the outcome is still unknown and may be unknown for a long time. Baha'u'llah's plan for world peace commands that rogue nations must be stopped by the combined forces of all the other nations. This unified response of the other nations must overwhelm and utterly defeat the rogue nation or nations. Disputes between nations must go before an international tribunal which will resolve the disputes, even when one or more of the nations involved do not agree to the case going before the tribunal. It should not be only the countries of the European Union and members of NATO that should be involved in the decision-making and planning. The whole world needs to be involved and unified. In Russia's case, if we look back a couple decades, we can see a growing pattern of their interferences in the elections, the governing of other countries, and the media of other countries to the detriment of those countries and the world. If international interventions by all other nations had occurred upon evidence of this tampering decades ago and taken unified and persistent actions against these intrusions, perhaps the world would not be in its current chaotic condition. Note that Russia is not the only offender here. International laws must be improved or introduced to codify the do's and don'ts of international relations, especially concerning invading other nations, cyber terrorism and cyber warfare, election tampering, and disinformation production and distribution. Then, through the years, as rogue nations and their rulers learn they cannot aggress against other nations, a form of political peace will evolve, the lesser peace. It will not make all warfare or military actions disappear entirely, however. It will be messy at first, getting nations to agree to the policies, defining parameters, and following through. The following through part is often the most difficult aspect. We are already in the early formative years of this lesser peace, whether we recognize it or not. The world's response to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia shows that we have learned some lessons and have gotten closer to Baha'u'llah's vision of world peace, but we have a long way to go. It shouldn't just be NATO and the European Union responding to the Russian invasion. It needs to be all the other countries through the United Nations, not just by the United States or just a small group of other countries. Then, someday, Baha'u'llah assures us, the most great peace will come. This ultimate peace will only come about when a large percentage of the world's population willingly, individual by individual, recognize Baha'u'llah as God's latest manifestation and follow his laws or otherwise follow his teachings, even if they do not become believers in Baha'u'llah. This will take far longer to happen because we do not force others to believe anything. One of the main tenets of the Baha'i faith is that individuals have to make their own spiritual investigations and decisions. No one should be forced to say they are a Baha'i or follow Baha'i laws. Such a thing would be completely antithetical to Baha'u'llah's teachings. All the biblical prophecies of the coming of the Messiah have been fulfilled. Some information about resources that you can research this claim will be provided shortly in a few slides. But prophecy fulfillment is not the reason we Baha'is, the followers of the new manifestation of God, believe that he has returned. Baha'u'llah's remarkable life, his 40 years of ministry, and the over 100 volumes of his counsels and guidance are the more important proofs of his identity. How many Baha'is are there? There's about 10 million Baha'is in the world at this time. The faith is spread all over the globe since it began in 1844, with about 170,000 Baha'is in the USA. How do we teach our faith? We have strong prohibitions in our laws to not proselytize, to never force our faith on others, or to try to convert others. We quite willingly teach our faith to those who want to hear it. There are websites and ways to contact Baha'is in your area. There are, in the next few slides, some more information will be provided. And note, seekers must convert themselves, basically. One of the reasons many of you watching this video have never heard of the Baha'i faith before is that our methods of teaching do not include violence, intimidation, coercion, or other aspects of proselytizing. Someone becoming a Baha'i must be through their own research, prayer, contemplation, and decision-making. We do have several significant houses of worship in the world. Being a new faith with relatively few believers compared to the older faiths of God makes it necessary for us to budget our money and plan well ahead. Up to recently, money for these temples have been dedicated to building what are called continental houses of worship, meaning one mother house of worship for each continent or subcontinent on the planet, as follows. One continental house of worship in Africa, one in Australia, Central America, Europe, India, Asia, that's the Indian subcontinent, North America, Pacific Islands, and South America. And here they are. These 8 continental Mashrikul Azkars, or houses of worship, or temples, are, starting at the top left, is the house of worship in Kampala, Uganda. To its right is the one outside of Sydney, Australia. Bottom right is the one in Hofheim, Langenhain, Germany. Then the one in Panama City, Panama, in the bottom left. Upper left is the one outside of New Delhi, India. It's often referred to as the Lotus Temple because its design is based on the lotus flower, which is common in India. Upper right is the North American House of Worship just north of Chicago in the city of Wilmette, Illinois. Lower right is the unusual looking house of worship. It also has had an architecture award to it, the house of worship outside of Santiago, Chile. Then the one for the Pacific Island nations located in Apia, Samoa. You may have noticed some similarities in the designs of these continental houses of worship, although individually they are very distinct in design. Well, all houses of worship or temples must have the following features. They must have 9 sides. This is symbolic of the fact that these houses of worship are for the whole world, not just members of the Baha'i faith. The number 9 is a mystical number in the Baha'i faith, symbolic of completeness. The temples must have a dome, and they are all to be on a base that is circular. and there are no images or statues allowed inside or out. Now that the continental houses of worship have all been completed, we are embarking on building some smaller houses of worship in some localities in the world. Pictured are two of them that have been completed. The one in Battambang, Cambodia is on the left, and the one in Colombia is on the right. There are a couple others in various stages of construction or planning. In Vanuatu, that's a group of islands in the Pacific, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in Kenya, and Papua New Guinea, and in a province of India. Please consider including the Baha'i Faith in your independent search for truth. Resources for further information follow. This and the next slide is a bibliography for this video. These two books provided the information used in the video. This book provided details of the Baha'i history of the events of Armageddon and was a great resource. The title, The Servant, the General, and Armageddon, a true story of an epic adventure in the footsteps of prophecy. Copyright 1998 by Roderick Maud and Derwent Maud. And you can see the other information there. It was available at one time from Amazon.com, and there may be other online and your neighborhood bookseller that you can get it from. This is the other book I heavily relied upon. The book title is Megiddo 1918, Lawrence Allenby and the March on Damascus. And it's one of the Prager Illustrated Military History series and came around 1999 by Brian Parrott. And you can see the availability was available at one time through Amazon.com, and it may even be available in your local library. If you'd like to find a book that gives a good, interesting overview of the Baha'i Faith, its main figures, history, beliefs, and its followers, without being preachy or trying to convert you, this is the book for you. Its title is Baha'u'llah and the New Era by the author J.E. Esselmont. It's available through Amazon.com and probably other online book vendors too. It may even be in your local library or your local independent bookstore. I recommend that you watch this professionally produced 30-minute video on the life of Baha'u'llah and the start of the Baha'i Faith as an introduction. Its title is The Prisoner of Akka. To access this video, go to YouTube and to the channel named Baha'i Vision, as you see at the bottom of the slide, and look for the video by that name, The Prisoner of Akka. You may also just be able to enter the title into the YouTube search box, The Prisoner of Akka, and then look for this exact title. This is a great little documentary. It's about an hour long. Its title is The Gate, Dawn of the Baha'i Faith. It's a story of the forerunner to the Messiah. It's a story of the Bab, and it's professionally produced, and you can watch it for free on YouTube. Just go to YouTube and put into the search box the channel name, The Gate, that you see in the bottom right, The Gate Film, all one word, The Gate Film, all one word. And in looking around there, you'll see that it's in quite a few different languages, so make sure you choose the right language. Again, it's about an hour long. It's for free. And this video about the life of Abdu'l-Baha, known as the Center of the Covenant and the Exemplar in the Baha'i Faith. Remember, he's the branch foretold in the Bible prophecy. Go to YouTube through youtube.com, and into the search box on that website, enter the channel name Baha'i Perspective, BAHA' perspective, as shown in the bottom right. Then on their page, scroll down to find the video titled Exemplar. It's 55 minutes in length, but it's so well done that the time passes very quickly. Here are some official Baha'i websites. Top one there is www.bahai.org. That's the international official website for those seeking information about the Baha'i Faith, and it has a link to the online library of sacred and authoritative texts that are available, accessible for free. Next is www.bahai.us. That's the USA official website for seekers who want information about the Baha'i community in the United States. Then we have bahai.org/library, and that is access, again, free to the sacred and authoritative texts and other publications by worldwide Baha'i community. Then at the bottom, the USA bookstore, that's bahaibookstore.com. It's the official online bookstore for the USA. You can purchase books, videos, music, and some other items through this site as well. You don't have to be a Baha'i to purchase things. The National Organization of the Baha'is of the United States has a presence on both Facebook and its own YouTube channel. Both of their pages in these websites goes by the name Baha'is of the United States. More websites. Top one, BahaiTeachings.org. This is a blog site where you can find numerous articles written about subjects touching on the Baha'i faith and the teachings. It's not an official site, but rather is produced by some individual Baha'is. There's a variety of topics in here, so if you have any specific topic, you can go on there and try to find articles to enlighten you what the view from the Baha'i faith might be. Next is the access address to the YouTube channel of the Wilmette Institute, which is an online Baha'i educational site that has webinars and actual online courses. Some are free and some at a cost, on a wide spectrum of Baha'i topics. The easiest way to get there is to go to youtube.com, then in the search box put their channel name, which is, as you see there, Wilmette Institute. We have a Baha'i World News Service which can be reached through the website you see there, https://news.bahai.org. And then to read some examples of some Baha'i prayers, go to www.bahaiprayers.org. In the next two slides will be some books that were written by Baha'u'llah and his son Abdu'l-Baha, the servant. Here you see Baha'u'llah's books, not all of them, but you can read them: The Hidden Words, Tablets of Baha'u'llah, Gleanings from the Writings of Baha'u'llah, the Book of Certitude, which is also referred to as the Kitab-i-Igan, Prayers and Meditations, Epistle to the Son of Wolf, and the Book of Laws, which is called the Most Holy Book. It's also referred to as the Kitab-i-Aqdas. Then these by Abdu'l-Baha, again, they're not all his books. First on top, Some Answered Questions. That's one that a lot of Christians find interesting because it addresses some of the Bible prophecies and some other Christian topics. The Secret of Divine Civilization, Paris Talks, Selections from the Writings of Abdu'l-Baha, and the Promulgation of Universal Peace. And here are a couple books on the topic of Bible prophecy fulfillment by the Baha'i Faith. This is just 3 of lots of books that are available on that topic. The top one by William Sears, titled Thief in the Night, The Case of the Missing Millennium. Next, Hushader Matla, his book I Shall Come Again. And Michael Sowers, the book The Prophecies of Jesus. That's specific to the book of Matthew, chapter 24. Here's a list of many of my other videos, all on YouTube, mostly on prophecy fulfillment by the main 4 founding figures of the Baha'i Faith. You can read the titles. There's a variety of topics. Pause the video to review them to see if any might interest you. Instructions on how to access them, all for free, on YouTube is on the next slide. Here's how to find my videos on YouTube. You have to get to YouTube first in the first method, and that is www.youtube.com. You get to the site, and in the search box on that site you enter my channel name of Integral Destiny 9. You see they're all one word, no spaces between, with the number 9 at the end. Or you can simply put the URL into the search box of your, like Google, whatever, www.youtube.com/c/ then my YouTube channel Integral Destiny 9, as you see there. And that should get you directly there, so I understand. And you'll see a list of videos, and you just have to roam around on my channel and find those videos. Please note that this video is an amateur production by this singular person, me, and it's very obvious it's an amateur production. It's not an official production by the Baha'i Faith community. Copyright protections are claimed. Please do not make changes, additions, or deletions to this presentation. Have questions? Contact me at the email address you see there. And thank you for watching.